great hall of the Galactic Academy stretched upward like the inside of a massive shell, its walls covered in glowing symbols from 100 different worlds and its ceiling lost somewhere in the purple mist that the Corthan species found comforting but most other beings found unsettling. Professor Velkreth stood at the center of the circular stage, his four eyes moving independently as they scanned the rows of students arranged in a spiral pattern around him, and his crystalline body caught the light in ways that made him look almost like a living statue carved from diamond. 47 students from 23 different species had gathered for this session of the Advanced Problem-Solving course, a class so difficult that most students spend years just trying to qualify for entry. And even then, many of them failed before the first cycle ended. There were Valorians in the upper rows, their hive mind connections allowing them to share thoughts instantly across dozens of bodies. And there were Delvian crystal beings who processed information through their entire physical structure rather than a central brain. The massive Grothian in the back had to crouch to fit beneath the ceiling, and the tiny whisperfolk near the front were so small that they needed special amplification fields just to be seen by their classmates. And then there was Marcus Chun. He sat in the third row, looking remarkably ordinary among all these extraordinary beings, with nothing special about his appearance except perhaps the curious way his eyes seemed to be always watching and always thinking. The other students had learned to ignore the human over the past few months because humanity was still so new to the galactic community that most species did not take them seriously, and their technology was considered primitive compared to civilizations that had traveled between stars for thousands of years. Professor Velkreth raised two of his forearms to call for silence, and the murmuring that had filled the hall faded away like morning mist under twin suns. Students of the Academy, his voice rang out in crystalline tones that the translation devices rendered into each species' native language. Today, I present to you the assignment that will determine your standing for this entire cycle. He gestured toward the center of the stage where a holographic display flickered to life, showing a complex web of lines and points that seemed to shift and change even as they watched it. Behold the Teshan paradox. A wave of gasps and worried murmurs swept through the assembled students, because everyone in the galaxy who had ever studied advanced logistics knew about the Teshan paradox, and everyone knew it had never been truly solved. The display showed a region of space where 7 gravitational anomalies existed in close proximity to each other, and these anomalies did not behave like normal gravity wells, but instead seemed to push and pull at each other in patterns that changed constantly. Any ship trying to travel through this region would face conditions that shifted from moment to moment, and the traditional approach to plotting a safe course required calculations so complex that even the most powerful computers in the galaxy struggled to keep up for 300 standard cycles. Professor Velkreth continued with obvious pride in presenting such a challenging problem. The greatest minds of the galactic community have attempted to develop a reliable solution to the Teshan paradox. He paused to let this sink in before adding, the current record for producing a workable solution belongs to a team of 7 Valorian hive minds working in perfect synchronization, and they required 4 full days to complete their calculations. The Valorians in the upper rows shifted with something that might have been pride or might have been embarrassment at having their achievement mentioned. You will have 1 standard week to produce your solutions, the professor announced. And I expect detailed methodology, comprehensive predictive models, and at least 3 alternative approaches to the core problem. A hand rose in the third row, and Professor Velkreth turned his 4 eyes toward the source with the mild annoyance of someone who did not appreciate interruptions. Yes, the Terran has a question. Marcus Chen lowered his hand and spoke in a clear voice that carried well despite the lack of any crystalline resonance or translation enhancement. Professor, I just want to make sure I understand the rules correctly, he said, while the other students watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to condescension. Are we required to use any particular methodology? Or are we free to approach this problem however we see fit? Velkrith's mandibles clicked together in what the translation devices interpreted as amusement, and several students from the elder species chuckled at what they assumed was youthful naivety. By all means, young human, the professor replied with a tone that dripped with the kind of patience one might show to a small child asking about something far beyond their understanding. Feel free to use whatever primitive tools your species has developed, though I doubt they will prove adequate for a challenge of this magnitude. Marcus nodded once and said nothing more, but those sitting close enough to see his face might have noticed a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The other students immediately began forming study groups and accessing their various computational resources, with the Valorians linking their minds together and the Delvians spreading their crystalline structures to maximize their processing capacity. The Grothian in the back activated a personal computer the size of a small vehicle, and the Whisperfolk connected themselves to a shared network that allowed them to function as a single distributed intelligence all around the hall. Students prepared for a week of intense work on a problem that had frustrated scholars for centuries. Marcus Chen simply leaned back in his seat and pulled out a small notebook made of actual paper, a curiosity that made his nearest neighbors stare in confusion, because most galactic species had abandoned physical writing materials thousands of years ago. His roommate, a Delvian named Shimmering Through Depths, whose crystalline body caught the light in constantly shifting patterns, leaned over with concern evident in the way their structure vibrated. You do not begin calculations? They asked in a voice that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The Teshin paradox is no small matter. And we have only 1 week. Marcus just smiled and tapped his pencil against the blank page of his notebook. I'm thinking, he said quietly. Sometimes that's the most important part. Shimmering Through Depths did not look convinced, but they had learned over the past few months that humans often did things that made no sense until suddenly they made perfect sense. The class ended with Professor Velkrith offering a few final words of encouragement that sounded more like warnings, and the students filed out in groups already, deep in discussion about their approaches to the impossible problem. Marcus walked out alone with his notebook still blank, and his expression thoughtful. None of them knew that everything was about to change. The dormitory wing reserved for carbon-based life forms was quiet in the hours after the problem-solving class ended. But that quietness was deceptive, because behind every door students were working furiously on the Teshin paradox. Marcus Chen sat cross-legged on his bed in the small room he shared with Shimmering Through Depths, and he had been staring at the holographic display of the 7 gravitational anomalies for nearly an hour without writing a single thing in his notebook. His roommate's crystalline form shifted with colors that indicated worry and confusion, and finally the Delvian could not contain their curiosity any longer. I do not understand your approach, Shimmering Through Depths said, while their body chimed softly with each word. Every other student has already begun complex calculations, and the Valorian hive minds have been processing data since the moment class ended. Marcus did not look away from the holographic display, but he smiled slightly at his friend's concern. Can I ask you something? He said in a voice that was calm and thoughtful. How long have the Delvians been traveling through space? The question seemed to catch Shimmering Through Depths off guard, and their crystalline structure flickered through several colors before settling on a shade that indicated deep consideration. Our species achieved faster than light travel approximately 12,000 standard cycles ago, they replied with evident pride. We were among the first to join the galactic community after the founding species established the initial networks. Marcus nodded slowly and asked another question that seemed equally unrelated to the task at hand. And in all that time, how many major breakthroughs in space travel have the Delvians developed? Shimmering Through Depths listed several achievements, including improvements to shield technology, advances in crystalline computing, and contributions to the standardization of hyperspace lane protocols. Those are all impressive, Marcus agreed. But they're all improvements to existing technology, right? Building on what was already there, rather than creating something completely new. The Delvians' colors shifted to indicate confusion, mixed with a slight hint of offense at what might have been an insult to their species' contributions. I am not criticizing, Marcus added quickly as he finally turned to look at his roommate. I'm trying to understand something about how the galaxy works. He stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the academy grounds, where beings from across the known universe moved along paths lit by bioluminescent plants imported from a dozen different worlds. Humans have only been in space for about 200 years, he said, while watching a group of Grothians lumber past far below. That's nothing compared to species like yours. And we're constantly reminded that we're the newcomers who have so much to learn. Shimmering Through Depths made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been an attempt to politely avoid commenting on uncomfortable truth. But here's the thing that keeps bothering me, Marcus continued as he turned back to face the room and the holographic display of the Tetian paradox that still floated in the air above his desk. Everyone keeps approaching this problem the same way. He gestured at the display with one hand while the other held his still blank notebook. The 7 anomalies create shifting gravitational conditions, and the accepted approach is to calculate how those shifts will affect a ship's trajectory, and then adjust the course constantly to compensate. That is the only logical approach, Shimmering Through Depths said with colors that indicated certainty. The gravitational fields are in constant flux, so the course must also constantly adjust. Marcus shook his head slowly and said, But why? Why what? Why fight against the gravitational shifts at all? Marcus asked as he moved closer to the holographic display and began rotating it with his fingers to look at the anomalies from different angles. What if we're supposed to work with them instead of against them? Shimmering Through Depths made a sound that was the Delvian equivalent of a skeptical snort. The shifts are chaotic and unpredictable, they said with colors that indicated patient explanation of an obvious fact. One cannot work with something that has no pattern. But Marcus was no longer listening because something in the holographic display had caught his attention. He had rotated the image to show the 7 anomalies from above. And from this angle, he could see how they moved in relation to each other over time. And suddenly something clicked in his mind. Wait, he whispered while his eyes grew wide. That's not chaos at all. He grabbed his pencil and began drawing rapidly in his notebook, sketching curves and arrows that seemed to follow an invisible logic only he could see. Back on Earth, he said while drawing, there's an ocean, and the ocean has currents that move water from one place to another in patterns that might look random if you only watched for a short time. He turned the notebook to show Shimmering Through Depths what he had drawn, which was a series of curved lines connecting the 7 anomalies in a flowing pattern. But if you study those currents over longer periods, Marcus continued with growing excitement, you start to see that they follow rules based on temperature and the rotation of the planet and the shape of the land beneath the water. I failed to see how planetary water currents relate to gravitational anomalies in space. Shimmering Through Depths said, with colors that indicated polite doubt. Marcus laughed and kept drawing as ideas poured out of his mind faster than his hand could capture them. The anomalies aren't randomly Shifting, he explained while adding more details to his diagram. They're interacting with each other in a recursive pattern, and each one affects the others in ways that create a kind of rhythm. He stood back and looked at what he had created, which was a simple map showing how a ship could enter the Teshin region at a specific angle and then let the gravitational forces themselves push it along rather than fighting against them. Humans learned to do this with wind and water thousands of years ago, he said with wonder in his voice. We called it sailing, and later we learned to do it with waves using boards called surfboards. Shimmering through depths moved closer to examine the diagram with the full attention of their crystalline senses. You are suggesting that instead of calculating millions of course corrections, they said slowly as understanding began to change the colors of their body, a ship should simply enter the region at the correct moment and allow the forces to carry it through. Marcus nodded eagerly and said, exactly. The forces aren't obstacles to avoid, they're currents to ride. He looked back at the holographic display of the 7 anomalies. And now that he knew what to look for, he could see the pattern clearly as the gravitational fields pushed and pulled in an endless dance that had been misunderstood for 300 years. Everyone has been trying to solve the problem the way it was presented, Marcus said quietly. But sometimes the smartest thing you can do is refuse to accept that the problem is what everyone says it is. He checked the time on his datapad and realized that less than 5 minutes had passed as he started drawing. Shimmering through depths, watched their human roommate gather up his notebook with a simple diagram that might just change everything. And they felt something that they had never felt before when looking at a member of the young Terran species. They felt awe. The problem-solving amphitheater was nearly empty when Marcus Chen walked back through its doors, with only Professor Velkrith remaining at the central podium where he was reviewing the initial submissions that some of the more eager students had already uploaded to the Academy network. The Kortham professor looked up with all 4 eyes as the human approached, and his crystalline features showed clear surprise at seeing anyone return so soon after the assignment had been given. Young Terran, Velkrith said with a tone that suggested Marcus had perhaps gotten lost and wandered into the wrong room. Did you forget something during class? The cleaning drones will collect any personal items and return them to your dormitory. Marcus shook his head and held up his notebook, which still contained only the single page of diagrams and notes that he had created in his room just minutes ago. No, Professor, he said in a steady voice that betrayed none of the nervousness he felt inside. I'm here to submit my solution to the Teshin paradox. For a moment, the great hall was completely silent. And then Professor Velkrith made a sound that the translation devices struggled to interpret, but which was clearly some form of laughter. I appreciate youthful enthusiasm, the professor said with his mandibles clicking in amusement. But I believe you have misunderstood the nature of this assignment. He gestured toward the holographic display that still floated above the stage, showing the complex web of shifting gravitational forces. The Teshin paradox has challenged our greatest scholars for 300 cycles. Velkrith continued with the patient tone of someone explaining reality to a child who believed they could fly. The fastest solution ever produced required 4 days of continuous calculation by 7 linked Valorian hive minds. Marcus nodded and said, I understand, Professor, but I would still like to submit my answer. The Korthan's 4 eyes blinked in a pattern that indicated deep confusion, and he studied the human for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of joke. Very well, he finally said while reaching out with one crystalline arm to take the offered notebook. Let us see what approach a species barely out of its gravity well has developed for a problem that has defeated civilizations old when your ancestors were still learning to walk upright. He opened the notebook to the single page of diagrams and notes, and his condescending expression immediately shifted to one of confusion as he examined the simple curves and arrows that Marcus had drawn. "What is this?" Velkrith asked while turning the page, as if expecting more content to be hidden somewhere. "Where are your calculations? Where is your methodology? Where are the predictive models I specifically requested?" "With respect, Professor," Marcus said while pointing to the diagram, "the calculations aren't necessary if you look at the problem." From a different angle, he reached toward the holographic display and rotated it to show the same top-down view that had triggered his insight back in his dormitory room. Everyone has been treating the gravitational shifts as obstacles that need to be predicted and avoided, Marcus explained while tracing the flowing lines of his diagram. But the shifts aren't random at all. They follow a recursive pattern created by the interactions between the 7 anomalies. Velkrith's mandibles stopped clicking, and his 4 eyes fixed on the human with an intensity that had not been there before. "Continue," he said in a voice that had lost its amusement. Marcus pointed to a specific spot on the holographic display where 3 of the anomalies came closest together. "If a ship enters the Teshan region at this point," he explained while drawing an imaginary line with his finger, "and at the right moment in the gravitational cycle, the forces themselves will push the ship along rather than fighting against it." He traced the path through the display, showing how a vessel could ride the gravitational currents like a surfer, riding ocean waves back on Earth. "The key is timing the entry point correctly," Marcus continued, "which requires understanding the rhythm of the interactions rather than trying to calculate every individual shift." Professor Velkrith stood in silence for what felt like a very long time, and Marcus began to worry that he had made a terrible mistake by presenting such an unconventional approach. Then the Corthan professor turned to his console and began entering commands at a speed that made his crystalline fingers blur. "Computer," he said in a voice that had become sharp and focused, "run simulation of the Teshan paradox using entry parameters specified in submitted solution, designated as Shen 1. The holographic display shifted to show a small dot representing a ship, positioned at exactly the point Marcus had indicated on his diagram. "Begin simulation." Velkrith commanded the students and faculty who later learned about what happened in those next few moments would speak of it for years to come. The simulated ship entered the Teshan region at the moment specified in Marcus's solution, and instead of being torn apart by the conflicting gravitational forces or requiring thousands of course corrections to survive, it simply flowed through the shifting fields like a leaf floating down a stream, the journey that the most advanced calculations said should take. Several days of careful navigation was completed in the simulation in a fraction of that time. "That cannot be correct," Velkrith whispered while his 4 eyes stared at the results displayed on his console. "Computer, run simulation again with full accuracy protocols." The simulation ran again and produced the same result. "Run verification using alternative computational models." Same result. "Cross-reference with all known data on Teshan region gravitational behavior." Same result. Professor Velkrith slowly turned to look at Marcus Chun, and the human could see that something fundamental had changed in the way the ancient Corthan was perceiving him. "How long?" Velkrith asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "Did it take you to develop this solution?" Marcus checked the time on his datapad and did some quick mental math. "About 5 minutes," he admitted. "Maybe a little less." The Corthan professor made no sound in response, because there was no sound in any language that could adequately express what he was feeling in that moment. A student from a species so young they had not yet earned respect in the galactic community had just solved a problem that had defeated the greatest minds of the galaxy for 300 years. And he had done it in less time than it took most beings to eat a simple meal. "Wait here," Professor Velkrith finally said while moving toward the communication console with a speed that seemed almost frantic. "I must contact the Academy Council immediately." Marcus stood alone in the great amphitheater, watching as the professor, who had looked down on him just hours ago, now moved with the urgency of someone who had witnessed something that would change history in his hand. He still held his notebook with its simple diagram, and he wondered if maybe he should have made the solution look more complicated. News traveled through the Galactic Academy faster than light itself could move through normal space. And within an hour of Professor Velcrath contacting the Academy Council, it seemed like every being on the massive station knew that something extraordinary had happened in the problem-solving. Amphitheater students abandoned their study groups and their complex calculations to crowd around the viewing galleries that overlooked the Great Hall, pressing against the transparent barriers in numbers that would have violated safety protocols if the security systems had not been temporarily overridden. By order of the council, the amphitheater had been transformed from a quiet classroom into what looked like the command center of a major military operation, with dozens of holographic displays floating in the air and representatives from at least 30 different species working at hastily assembled workstations. Admiral Dex Wren of the Valorian fleet had arrived within 20 minutes of being notified, her forearms moving in constant motion as she directed her staff to run verification after verification of the human student's impossible solution. Chief Scholar Fremnoz of the Valorian Collective had linked herself to a network of 17 hive minds spread across 4 different sectors, all of them working together to analyze the simple diagram that Marcus Chen had drawn in his paper notebook. Even a delegation from the Galactic Commerce Authority had appeared, their interest sparked by the potential implications for shipping routes that passed through or near the Teshan region. Marcus himself had been moved to a small platform near the center of the activity, where he stood feeling increasingly out of place as beings who held power over entire star systems argued about the meaning of his 5-minute sketch. Shimmering through depths had pushed through the crowd to stand beside their human roommate, and the Delvian's crystalline body shifted through colors that indicated a mixture of excitement and protective concern. They are treating you like a Laberta specimen. Shimmering through depths observed quietly while a group of Corthan scientists took measurements of Marcus from across the room using equipment he did not recognize. Are you well? Marcus nodded, even though he was not entirely sure that he was well, because the last few hours had been the strangest of his life, and they seemed to be getting stranger by the minute. Professor Velcrath approached the platform with an expression that was difficult to read even for beings who had spent their lives studying Corthan body language. We have completed the 17th independent verification, the professor announced in a voice loud enough for everyone in the hall to hear. And I must inform the assembly that the solution submitted by student Marcus Chen of Earth is completely valid. A murmur swept through the gathered crowd, and Marcus could see expressions of disbelief and wonder on faces that had never before looked at a human with anything other than dismissive tolerance. Furthermore, Velcrath continued while consulting a data display that floated beside him. Preliminary calculations indicate that the slingshot current method, as the human has termed it, reduces average transit time through the Teshan region by 43%. Compared to the previous best theoretical solution. The murmur became a roar as beings who had spent their careers developing complex navigation systems realized that their life's work had just been rendered obsolete by a student with a pencil. Admiral Dex Wren pushed through the crowd to stand before Marcus's platform, and her 4 eyes studied him with an intensity that made him want to step backward. Tell me, human, she said in a voice that carried the weight of someone who had commanded fleets in battles that decided the fate of worlds. How did you see what none of us could see for 300 cycles? Marcus thought carefully before answering, because he understood that whatever he said in this moment would be recorded and analyzed, and debated for years to come. I think, he began slowly while choosing his words with care, that the problem was not really about the gravitational anomalies at all. The Admiral's expression shifted to indicate that she did not understand, and she gestured for him to continue. The real problem, Marcus explained, was that everyone who looked at the Teschen paradox started with the same assumptions about what the problem was and how it should be solved. He pointed to the holographic display that still showed the 7 anomalies shifting and flowing in their eternal dance 12,000 years ago. Someone presented this as an optimization problem, he said, and every scientist who came after them accepted that framing without question, because why would they doubt something that had been accepted as true for so long? Chief Scholar Vremnos, speaking through one of her local bodies while the rest of her hive mind continued to process data, asked, "Are you suggesting that our collective wisdom was itself the obstacle?" Marcus nodded and said, "On Earth, we have a saying that a fish does not notice the water it swims in. And I think something similar happened here." He gestured toward the beings gathered in the hall, representatives of civilizations that had traveled between stars when humans were still figuring out how to make fire. "Your species have so much knowledge and so much history," Marcus continued, "and that's incredible and valuable in ways I can barely comprehend. But it also means that you've had thousands of years to build up assumptions about how the universe works." He held up his notebook, showing the simple diagram that had started all of this. "Humans have only been in space for 200 years, he said. "So we haven't had time to learn what's supposed to be impossible. And sometimes that ignorance is actually an advantage." The hall fell silent as beings who had lived for centuries in civilizations that had endured for millennia contemplated the idea that their greatest strength might also be their greatest weakness. "Admiral." Vexrin finally spoke again, and her voice carried a note of something that might have been humility. "You looked at our ancient puzzle with fresh eyes," she said slowly, "and you saw it not as we had always seen it, but as it actually was." Marcus shrugged slightly and replied, "I just asked a different question than everyone else was asking." Professor Velkruth stepped forward with his 4 eyes focused on the human student, who had just appended 3 centuries of academic certainty. "And what question was that?" he asked. Marcus smiled and said, "Instead of asking how to fight against the gravitational forces, I asked what would happen if we stopped fighting and started surfing." For the first time since the verification process had begun, genuine laughter echoed through the ancient hall of the Galactic Academy, and it came from beings of every species and every world. A human had taught them something that all their wisdom had failed to reveal. And the lesson was that sometimes wisdom itself was the thing that needed to be questioned. The celebration that followed the official verification of Marcus's solution lasted for 3 standard days, with beings from across the galactic community gathering to witness the signing of the Chun Navigation Protocol and the formal recognition of humanity's contribution to interstellar travel. Marcus had smiled for so many holographic recordings and shaken so many appendages of various shapes that he felt like his face might permanently freeze in an expression of polite gratitude. But now, on the 4th night after his solution had changed everything, he finally found a moment of peace in the Academy's meditation. Gardens were bioluminescent plants from a cons from a cons from a tons, or bioluminescent plants from a times from a plants from a cons. 100 different worlds created a soft glow that painted the darkness in colors without names in any human language. He sat on a bench made from material that adjusted itself to perfectly support whatever being chose to rest upon it, and he let out a long breath as he stared up at the unfamiliar stars that filled the sky beyond the garden's transparent dome. The sound of approaching footsteps made him turn, and he recognized the 4-armed silhouette of Admiral Vexrin moving through the garden paths toward him. "May I join you?" Young human? She asked with a formality that seemed out of place given everything that had happened between them in recent days. Marcus gestured to the space beside him on the bench, and the Admiral lowered herself with the careful precision of someone whose body was built more for war than for rest. I wanted to speak with you privately, Thexrin said while all four of her eyes looked up at the same stars Marcus had been contemplating, away from the recorders and the politicians, and the scientists who are still trying to understand how you did what you did. I'm not sure I completely understand it myself, Marcus admitted. It just seemed obvious once I looked at the problem from a different angle. The Admiral made a sound that was her species' equivalent of a thoughtful hum. I have commanded warships for 600 cycles, she said in a voice that carried the weight of centuries of experience. And I have watched civilizations rise and fall and rise again across the spiral arm. She turned to look at Marcus directly, and all four of her eyes held an intensity that made him feel very young and very small. In all that time, she continued, I have learned that the galaxy tends to run in patterns, with young species climbing the same ladder that older species climb before them and making the same discoveries and the same mistakes. That makes sense, Marcus said. Why reinvent the wheel when you can learn from those who came before? Exactly, Thexrin agreed. And that philosophy has served the galactic community well for longer than your species has existed. She paused and seemed to be gathering her thoughts before continuing. But what you did with the Teshan paradox has forced me to confront something that I think many of the elder species have been avoiding for a very long time. Marcus waited in silence for her to continue because he could sense that whatever she was about to say was important. We have been so proud of our accumulated wisdom, the Admiral finally said. So confident that our thousands of years of experience made us better equipped to understand the universe than any younger species could possibly be. She gestured at the stars above them with all four of her arms in a motion that seemed to encompass everything. But wisdom can become a prison if it teaches you what to expect, instead of teaching you how to see what is actually there, she said. And I believe that is exactly what happened with the Teshan paradox. Marcus nodded slowly as he began to understand what she was trying to tell him. You think that humans might see other things differently too? He asked. I think, Thexrin replied carefully, that your species has a gift that the rest of us forgotten we ever possessed. She turned to face him fully, and her voice took on the gravity of a formal pronouncement. You see the universe with fresh eyes because you have not yet been taught what is supposed to be impossible, she said. And that freshness is more valuable than any technology or any weapon or any accumulated wisdom that the elder species possess. Marcus felt the weight of her words settling over him, like a cloak that he was not sure he was ready to wear. That's a lot of pressure to put on a species that just figured out how to travel between stars, he said with a nervous laugh. The Admiral surprised him by reaching out with one of her forehands and placing it on his shoulder in a gesture that felt almost parental. It is not pressure, she said gently. It is possibility. She stood and looked down at him with an expression that mixed ancient wisdom with newly discovered respect. Today you solved the problem that defeated us for 300 cycles, she said. And tomorrow you will look at other problems with those same fresh eyes and see solutions that we cannot imagine. She began to walk away, but paused after a few steps to deliver one final thought. The galaxy is full of mysteries that the elder species have given up trying to solve because we decided long ago that they were unsolvable, she said, while looking back over her shoulder. But now I wonder how many of those mysteries are simply waiting for someone who does not know that they are supposed to be impossible. She disappeared into the darkness of the garden, leaving Marcus alone with the stars and the glowing plants and the growing realization that his simple solution to a navigation problem might have been the Beginning of something much larger, he pulled out his notebook. The same paper notebook that had drawn so many stares and so much condescension from beings who had forgotten that sometimes the simplest tools were the most powerful ones. The pages were still mostly blank because he had only needed one page to change the understanding of an entire galaxy. He wondered how many more pages he would fill before his journey was complete. And he wondered what other impossible problems were waiting to be solved by someone who simply asked different questions somewhere in the distance. A ship departed from the Academy station and set course for the Teshan region, where it would be the first vessel ever to navigate using the slingshot current method that a human student had sketched in pencil. It would not be the last. Marcus smiled and tucked his notebook back into his pocket before standing to return to his dormitory, where, shimmering through depths, would be waiting to hear about his conversation with the Admiral. The stars above him were still unfamiliar, but they no longer felt as distant as they once had. After all, he thought to himself, they were just waiting for someone to look at them with fresh eyes and see what everyone else had missed. The future was full of impossible problems, and humans were just getting started.